I call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I must say that while being a long-standing member of the Primary Production Select Committee of the previous member is, of course, the Chair, I did actually stand aside for the Honourable Trevor Mallard, who takes the role of animal welfare within our caucus. But so I wasn't there for a number of the hearings, but I have followed this very closely because, as has been said previously by speakers, this does go to the heart of New Zealand's production systems. And as a passionate advocate for primary industries, I know the things that we need to protect, Mr Speaker, and starting, of course, from, I guess, biosecurity, food safety, animal welfare probably comes third in terms of hierarchy of the things that we need to uphold, both in a reality sense and in a reputational sense, because if New Zealand is to continue to export food, then the people who have to pay or should pay a little bit more for quality food want to know that it's been grown and produced ethically. And indeed, this piece of legislation moves us forward some way in that area. And so Labor will be supporting it, Mr Speaker. But it's an interesting time because we have a society that is becoming further disconnected from the realities of production. And they want meat, but they don't want slaughter, Mr Speaker. And this bill is one more realistic step to address the issues, to minimise any potential harm to animals, but still leave in place the reality that animals are grown and produced for slaughter. And there will be some who are vegan who don't want to eat that, that's true, and that's their right. The vast majority of people in the world need protein, Mr Speaker, and we produce it. We produce it in a very sound and ethical way, and a safe way, and in a way that does minimum harm, for the most part, to the animals in the system. And we want to continue with that. So we are making technical changes to the bill. We're addressing some tricky issues like the use of animals in the area of experimentation, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, Mr Speaker. But not only is there a dilemma across society around the one of meat but doesn't want to come from a slaughter process, they want it cheap meat and cheap food. But of course they don't necessarily want to deal with the realities that we have to have commercial systems of production that some say are factory. By international standards, most of New Zealand's systems are pretty much organic. Indeed, if you looked at the sheep grazing out in the Mackenzie country, you'll say they're as close to the basic first step in the evolutionary process as you could imagine. Freedom to roam, handled probably 2 or 3 times a year, Mr Speaker. New Zealand is blessed with systems that are as close to ideal as you could get. But there are, in some areas, systems, particularly in the area of egg production, poultry production, Mr Speaker, pork, and increasingly in the area of dairying, where we are getting to the point of intensity where the public are asking, is there a better way than the ways that have been conducted over recent years? NAWAC, the organisation referred to by the previous speaker, is an independent organisation set up to address these quite challenging ethical areas in an appropriate and independent way. And I think they do a very, very good job, Mr Speaker. We've got the issue of colonies, cages for poultry, what size they should be, what is the normal behaviour or range of behaviours for those chickens. And what has happened over recent years is we have moved as a country and through legislation to expand the areas in which chooks live, to give them more movement, to give them more freedom. And my colleague, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, says that just about all those animals should have the right to go outside. Now, we have some systems like that in the country, but not all of them. If we were to move to those systems within a set period of 2 to 3 or 4 or 5 years, then there would be a cost to the consumer and the producer. And some might say that's a perfectly reasonable cost. There's a reality, of course, in a low-paid economy, particularly under a national government where they seem to like 0 hours contracts, that people can't afford to pay for that food, Mr Speaker. So there are transitional provisions here, and the exceptions and the extensions to what are deemed not ideal conditions are necessary to allow that transition to occur in a commercially realistic way. And I think we have to, while some of us, or my colleague is perhaps more reluctant to accept that, some of us see that as a normal and sensible transition. But the reality for New Zealand as the producer of fine quality food, we will have to move in that direction. That is with eggs, poultry and pork, and I think those industries have accepted that. The difficult one of dairy is one that's yet to be resolved. And we are seeing, because of some Europeans, I have to say, in reality, who have come into this country and think they know how to show us how to milk cows, they want to put all the cows inside in an intensive housed farming system, Mr. Speaker. I'd suggest they're not making money this year at the payout from Fonterra, so it might clip their wings and their enthusiasm. But that intensive system, while having some advantages over effluent management, does move a long way from the pastoral system that we have known, if not perfected, certainly developed well, and it's been the hallmark, I guess, of our production systems. So dairying's heading in the other direction at a time when other sectors are moving to a less intensified system that provides the animals with a bit more scope, a bit more freedom, and I guess the range of natural movement as deemed. Mr. Speaker, I think we have to warn dairying here that moving down that path, they have to be very cautious about what that might mean to New Zealand's brand reputation. It's not something I think we should encourage. The cost of production simply climbed to the point where we're at risk in years of low payout, where those farmers, and if there's more of them, get encouraged into those systems, they will go broke. Mr. Speaker, back to the legislation. It does include some good objectives, Mr. Speaker. One in particular that I quite like, and that is that you know, there'll be encouragement for the labelling of animal products that create a commercial incentive for improved animal welfare standards. Now that's a value proposition to those people who are moving their production systems to a better one for animal welfare, and it should be labelled, it should be identified, and the consumers should know if they're going to pay a bit more for the food, why they're doing so. Why then doesn't the national government endorse country of origin labelling for other food? Why won't they buy into that? I suggest because the supermarkets, their mates will simply bullying them into avoiding that. The fact is that we have trans-Tasman standards and Australia buys into country of origin labelling and New Zealand doesn't. So while this legislation encourages labelling for better animal welfare standards, which I think is a good thing, there's nothing from the government to say that they should identify where the food was produced in the first place. And so it's quite a bizarre contradiction in legislation once this has passed that will be encouraging labelling on one hand and in fact avoiding it on the other hand. Mr. Speaker, as I said, the extension that was proposed under the legislation will now be closed down. That is that in transitioning from the current standards to better standards of animal welfare and production systems, the reality is that we must allow that transition to occur. If they were chopped off, that would be unrealistic, uneconomic and indeed undesirable for many of the consumers across the country. So all in all, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a good piece of legislation. The question I'd like to ask at the end of this is that John Key called into Saudi Arabia and we're told had discussions about the renewal of the live export trade to that country. Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard too many people asking for that or thinking it's a good thing, other than the Prime Minister perhaps promising his Saudi counterpart that we'll get this underway. So I think it's incumbent upon the government and the Prime Minister to answer that question. Are we going to resume live exports for slaughter or not? And while there was a hint from the previous speaker, no. Well, there's the Minister said no. That's good. It's good to hear that because I don't think there's any benefit and I'm pleased to hear him say that. So I hope he tells his Prime Minister, his boss, that it's no good kidding the Saudi Arabians that we might get a renewal of that trade. Mr Speaker, the last thing I'd say, that animal testing for cosmetics, we don't agree with that. Indeed, it's pleasing to see, as the father of 5 daughters, that cosmetics and makeup is kind of on the way out. And I think that's great. It'll save me a fortune. But all the women around here, Mr Speaker, I don't see one of them that needs those cosmetics. And indeed, we don't need the animal testing to try and prove them. Mr Speaker, this is a wise piece of legislation, but the government's got to follow through on what it says it's doing here.
Call Stuart.